All right, Alexander, let's do an update with regards to Ukraine and what is going on there. Let's see here. The Duma, actually, I think they've already voted on the ratification of these four regions. Now I believe it goes to the Federal Council, I believe, is next. And anyway, I think tomorrow it's all wrapped up.
Yeah.
And these territories, or these regions, are now part of the Russian Federation. And to me, that means that we're going to definitely, not most likely, definitely going to get some clarity as to what Russia's plans are. Because we have Kadyrov talking about how, and I'm paraphrasing, very loosely paraphrasing, how the Russian command is effing things up.
Yeah.
We have Rogozhin, I believe. Is that his name? Who's in charge of Wagner?
Yeah. Prigozhin.
Yeah. Okay. So he supports.
Yeah.
Prigozhin. He supports Kadyrov's statements.
Yeah.
We have a lot of analysts, let's say, all over the internet, who are kind of scratching their head with Lyman, but also about this latest 3 counteroffensives in Kherson, where one apparently did break through 20 kilometers. I've heard reports saying that the Russians have now, they've hit at that advancement due to a lot of weather conditions, and they kind of got trapped. I don't know. Anyway, you know what? To me, it's interesting stuff to get into the details of all of these offensives and villages changing hands one to another and all of this stuff. But I'm not really looking at that anymore. I'm looking at the fact that from the Russian perspective, from the Russian side of things, they consider these territories Russia. And I'm speaking once again from the Russian side of things. The Russians, if they see their territory being occupied or invaded, I imagine the Russians are going to have to answer. So, of course, Ukraine sees it differently. I'm always speaking about how the Russians now view these 4 regions. So, we should get some clarity as to what is going on, because a lot of people continue to ask, where is the Russian Air Force? Where are the Russian missiles? Where is the Russian military? What is going on here? I mean, once again, you have the doubt after this latest incident in Lyman and Kherson, and then you have Kadyrov's post. But I think clarity is for me the word after these referendums. We're going to finally figure out what the plan is. What the plan is.
I think you're absolutely right. And by the way, I think you're absolutely right not to now start stressing or looking with a magnifying glass at every one of these particular movements in one place or another, because it seems to me that what we're seeing are the last flickers of the war that's been fought from February up to now, and presumably now that these territories are going to be part of the Russian Federation, which I believe formally happens tomorrow, by the way, then, everything must change, because if they are territories of the Russian Federation and Ukrainian troops are stationed in them and fighting them, then by definition, the Russians must treat that as an act of aggression and must respond. And they must respond with the full force of their military, which very obviously and clearly they have not been doing up to now. I'm going to make a suggestion. I'm going to just say what I think about this. I've been giving a lot of thought to this matter. I think the early stages of this war, when it was launched on the 24th of February up to about March, I think that the Russian idea, which we discussed at the time, and I think that our analysis at the time was actually a valid one. It was not to conquer Ukraine. It was not to capture Kiev. It was to force the Ukrainians into a negotiation and into a peace deal, which would finally, once and for all, solve the Ukrainian issue from a Russian point of view. And they came quite close. There were negotiations. There was a meeting in Istanbul. Ukraine came up with proposals which apparently acknowledged or seemed to acknowledge that Crimea and Donbass would be lost to Ukraine, and that Ukraine itself would take a neutral status, and that the Russians would have veto power over deployment of foreign forces in Ukraine, even to conduct exercises. And then, as we know, that all fell apart. And then after that, we had this strange limbo period, which is the one that lasted from April until now, in which the Russians carried on with military operations pretty much as they had been doing in that first period, with the same forces that they'd used in that same period. In fact, if anything, they actually reduced them, and they seem to reduce them quite significantly. And they continue to make progress in Donbass, but they don't seem to have put together some kind of a strategy. And I can't help but think that what happened was that there must have been very, very complex discussions going on, both in Moscow, by the Russians, between each other, what to do, where to go forward. We'd all agreed on one plan, which was the plan that basically failed in March. What new plan are we going to come up with going forward? And of course, and I continue to repeat this, and I insist on this, a plan that they had to discuss, a new plan that they had to discuss with their allies, specifically with China, with India, and with countries like that. And eventually, in September, after what I suspect was a protracted period of discussion, we've come up with this new plan, which is that they're going to annex these 4 regions, make them a part of Russia. And at that point, as I said, if the Ukrainians continue fighting, it will become aggression, and the Russians will have to use their forces to counter it. And we're seeing lots of pictures now of large convoys of Russian tanks and machines and things moving towards the battlefronts. And we've also had, of course, the partial mobilization. All of these are clearly synchronized with this decision. But along with all of that, there's still a lot of uncertainty, both about Russian intentions, ultimate intentions, and about how they intend to conduct the war. And this is where I think Kadyrov and people like him, Prigozhin, who runs the Wagner Group, are beginning to become exasperated, because you can see that they're getting increasingly frustrated by the fact that this war is being fought in this very strange way, with, one arm tied behind your back, even as the other side is fighting with everything that it possibly has. And it's understandable that they're getting angry. Remember, Kadyrov and Prigozhin, they actually have their men fighting on the battlefields. They're becoming extremely critical of the Russian command. Kadyrov criticized one particular general, General Lapin, and in fact, his criticism, according to some Russians, might have been misplaced, because Lapin, according to some people, is in fact actually a good general who's actually very forceful on the battlefields and has been trying to get Moscow to go for mobilization since June. So, it may be that Kadyrov's got it twisted there, or it may be that there's some bad blood between Kadyrov and Lapin, which we just don't know about. But one way or the other, you can understand the growing frustration and the growing anger. And I don't think Kadyrov and Prigozhin are just talking on their own. I mean, you read all the Telegram channels, the same Telegram channels that I do. I mean, there are an awful lot of very angry people there. They're saying, why have we been fighting this war? Why was Ukraine ever allowed to mount a counteroffensive at all, anywhere, in any place? Why are we retreating from places like Liman, which could have very easily been defended? Why did we give up Kharkiv, or the Izium region, basically without a fight? I mean, we're supposed to be the great power. Surely we should not be retreating in this. So you can see the anger. And I'm going to say something else. There's going to be events over the next couple of days, which is going to deepen that anger, because once more, the Russians, or at least Putin, is insisting upon going about this in incredibly legalistic ways. So the Duma is meeting today. They've now ratified the accession treaties. The Federation Council meets tomorrow, and then it has to ratify the accession treaties. Then Putin himself signs, and it seems only on Wednesday do these territories become a part of Russia. And there will be lots of people. In fact, I can tell you there are lots of people who are saying, why are we waiting? Why are we protracting all of this? Why this lack of urgency? Why this sense of, taking your time to do these things by the book when we ought to be moving much faster? And then when we do have these territories within the Russian Federation, when we do treat this as aggression against our country, what are our plans going to be? Do we limit ourselves to driving the Ukrainians from these regions, in which case the Ukrainians might simply go on attacking us there and we could be involved in a war without end? Or do we actually fight this war, as perhaps we should have done right from the first day, as a war that has to be fought until victory, and victory has to be defined as some kind of regime change in Kiev, or perhaps ultimately the occupation of Kiev and the reconstruction of that country? Perhaps some of them would even say it's annexation by Russia itself. So, you can see all these tensions, and they're boiling up, and they're getting stronger almost by the hour. And Kadyrov does tend to come out and speak out in this angry way from time to time. But there's no doubt at all that there is an awful lot of people in Russia who are backing him. And that's why his comments are getting the traction that they are.
Right. So the only way the collective West can win this conflict is if they get regime change in Moscow.
Yes.
And I believe that a big part of their game plan is to get these tactical victories.
Yes.
To take Lyman, to do a breakthrough in Kherson, to then have the media amplify it times 100, right? To make it seem like this was, this was D-Day. This was the ultimate battle, Lyman. It was the ultimate battle. It's the ultimate strategic point. Yeah. And this is the most important city next to Kiev. And they do a great job of doing that, right? Yeah. The collective West definitely has the soft media power advantage. They have the social media. They have the publications, the New York Times, the CNNs. They have it all. They have it all there. And so that's what they do. And they also pick up on the doubts and the anger of many analysts on Telegram and Twitter and these types of channels. And they amplify that to say, look, or they pick up the statement from Kadyrov and they say, look, you see, there's trouble in the Kremlin. People in Russia are upset. They're starting to doubt Putin, because all of this is feeding on their hopes and their dream to somehow create, a boiling point of discontent, which will spill over and lead to some sort of palace intrigue or overthrow of the Putin government. Right? That's what they have in the back of their minds. And the UK Ministry of Defense actually put out a statement hinting at that. They acknowledged that Lyman was insignificant, but then they said, well, but this is a terrible blow to the Kremlin. It's a political embarrassment. People are angry. Things are fracturing. Putin is, he's on shaky ground, right? So, we have to be aware of that. But that's just one comment that I have with regards to what's happening. Now let's take a very drastic, let's take a 1% scenario. A 1% scenario. What if Russia does nothing?
Yeah.
After these regions are entered into Russia. What if Russia does nothing? What if they just continue to just do what they've been doing?
Yeah. Right.
What happens?
Yes.
This is a
Right. Okay.
drastic viewpoint, by the way. This
Yeah.
is not. This is very drastic.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
I want to. I want to throw it
Yeah.
out there. What if
Right.
that does happen? What if
Right. Right.
nothing
Well,
changes?
let's deal with the second point. If they do that, then I mean that would be a catastrophic misjudgment. I mean, at that point, I mean, all the scenarios that you outlined about anger boiling over in Russia itself could become real. I cannot believe that that's what's going to happen. I mean, it seems to me that if it does, Putin is Putin. The point where Putin himself will be directly criticised will come. Now, up to this moment in time, when people like Kadyrov criticise the approach taken, they've been very careful not to criticise Putin. They blame others. They blame, the chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov. They blame General Lapin. There's many criticisms now of Shoigu, who's the defense minister. They blame people like that. They don't blame Putin. But if the war just drags on in the same way that it's been doing, with the Russians taking Bakhmut here and losing place there, and it just goes on and stretches out, then I'm afraid at that point we could start to see at some point a political crisis in Moscow. I think that is not going to be acceptable to the Russian population. And then, of course, the big question is which direction that political crisis take. Does it result in a big swing towards the hardliners, or does it result in a swing towards the more liberal forces in Russia, which are still there? So I think that the Kremlin is understands this far too well to allow that kind of scenario. And if you look at every step that they've been taking, I mean, it's not just the incorporation of these regions, it's the announcement of mobilization. I think the announcement of mobilization is as important in its way as the decision to incorporate these regions into Russia, because the mobilization can only be understood as a decision that they're going to start to take this military thing seriously. If they were only going to defend, I wouldn't have thought that they would have needed 300,000 men. I mean, I would have thought that the very fact that they're calling up 300,000 men points to an offensive, in other words, to some kind of a more aggressive approach going forward after the ground starts to harden in the winter, and some kind of a winter offensive. That is the expectation. But of course, if they don't do that, then of course they are at risk, and they would in that case be playing, and this is the important point, into precisely the kind of game, the regime change game that the West is promoting. I mean, you're absolutely right. What's one of the most interesting things about the reporting in the Western media of the war over the last couple of weeks is that I've noticed that the Western media is no longer reporting things that Ukraine is saying. What they're actually doing is that they're reporting the criticisms and the accounts of the fighting which are being made by these Russian critics of, the conduct of the war. So, I mean, we both know about bloggers like Rebar. If Rebar is a person or a group, I've no idea. But, I'm suddenly reading, in places like The Guardian and The Telegraph and the Financial Times and some of the American media, people actually starting to quote people like Rebar, who's very critical in many ways of the way in which the Russians are conducting the war. And and the sort of very pessimistic view of the conduct of operations that they're taking. And you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to amplify these voices in order to give them strength, transmit them back to Russia, because, of course, to be straightforward about it, I don't know how many Russians follow these Telegram channels. Probably a few do, but they're picking up these stories, and it's creating doubts and uncertainties. And you can see themselves how these tactical successes that the Ukrainians achieve, ephemeral though they may be. I mean, Liman, in my opinion, was a minor event, actually. Small place. I doubt it had much strategic importance. Troops involved on either side, relatively few. But it did matter to some people in Russia. They talked it up. Now the narrative in the West is of cracks within the Kremlin, arguments there, quarrels, backfighting, intrigues. That then gets fed back into Russia. That creates more doubts in Russia. That creates an impression that things are not going well and that Putin himself is losing control. So he's got to see this thing through. He's got to make that decision once this perhaps unduly protracted process is finalized, of having these people, these regions join Russia. And he's then got to press forward with the offensive that needs to be undertaken. And my own personal view about this, and I'm going to say this straightforwardly, is that I am not, as I've said so many times, a military person. Perhaps some of the military leaders are not up to their jobs. But overall, my overwhelming sense is that the real problem is not from the military. It is the political constraints that Putin imposed on them at the start of the operation, which has been constraining them and has been making it much more difficult for them to do their jobs effectively. I don't understand why a military that performed superbly well in Syria, for example, and which managed to defeat an insurgency in Chechnya very effectively, would struggle in a place like Ukraine unless they were basically very limited by the terms of the operation that Putin, the framework that Putin created. And I suspect that many of them have probably been exasperated by it as well. And as I said, I mean, it seems that General Lapin was complaining in June that they needed mobilization then, and the Kremlin wasn't listening, by which I mean Putin himself wasn't prepared to do it.
No, the framework in the beginning, like you said, the framework was restrained because they wanted to figure out a way to get Kiev to just agree to the terms. That didn't happen. And then it seems that it was constrained because the Kremlin, I was going to say got itself into, but they had the dialogue with their partners.
Yeah,
China, India, BRICS, the SCO, Brazil, all of these, the rest of the world, let's just call it the rest of the world, they got into this protracted dialogue with the rest of the world where Putin turned what was initially an SMO to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, and it turned into an SMO that became much larger than even a war between Russia and Ukraine. This turned into the deindustrialization of Germany. It turned into the demilitarization of Europe and the United States. It turned into de-dollarization. It turned into an energy war. I mean, it started. I think Russia wanted this to be something very quick and short and simple. Let's just get our terms agreed to. Let's end this in a month and we're all good. And then it turned into something that became even bigger than a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think that's what it is now.
Yeah, exactly.
And so Putin had to constrain it in that manner as well, because this is more than just Russia and Ukraine, as Putin noted in his speech the other day. So let's take the most likely scenario to finish up the video. What I described was a very, very unlikely, and what you described was a very unlikely scenario. Just to clarify for everyone that's viewing this video, it makes no sense that Russia would go through all of this process to do nothing.
Exactly.
But people are talking about it. Now let's take the most likely scenario. Russia goes full in. Ukraine, you're occupying Kherson, you're occupying Lyman, you're occupying Donbass. You continue to try to advance into our territory. Russia's going to consider it its territory. You continue to try to encroach in our territory. That's it. What happens there?
Well, Andy, before I answer that question, can I just
International
point,
level,
yeah,
partner level, military, all of it. Yeah.
yeah. Can I just make the point though that we can be very critical of Putin and the way in which he's approached this thing, but do note that he's managed to keep everybody on side. I mean, the Russians have now taken this astonishing step,
Very successful.
absolutely, of annexing territory that according to international law, and we have to say this, is part of Ukraine. And he's been able to keep all his allies with him. I mean, at the UN Security Council session, China, India, and Brazil, and this is Bolsonaro's Brazil still, it might still be, but anyway, we'll come to that in another video probably. But they all went along with Russia. I mean, they refused to criticize Russia. There's no huge wave of indignation across the world that sees Russia as the predatory aggressor. Maybe in the West there is, but outside the West that hasn't happened, and that's very much a product of the way in which Putin has conducted this up to this point. Now, what will the Russians do? What going all in? What will that actually mean? My own guess is, and I'm going to say this, and again, it may be very frustrating for some people. I think they will launch a big offensive, and I think these are going to be big offensives, and I think we're going to see Russian aircraft used, Russian missile strikes, attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine like we've never seen, attacks on the power system, the railway system, the bridges, all that kind of thing. But I suspect that once the Russians are in a position of advantage, they will again probably try some kind of negotiation process. And that might infuriate a lot of people, but I think that is, again, what they will try to do. And I think that before they move towards outright annexation of Ukraine, if that is the ultimate objective, and I'm not just saying it is, by the way, I don't know. I mean, I think that the very least, they will want some kind of new government in Kiev that will pave the way for that and that they can negotiate with. And the fact that Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a pro-Russian politician, is now back in Russia, pro-Russian Ukrainian politician is now in Russia, that might point to some kind of long-term plan there as well. But this is the point. We will get clarity after these events, but it will only be clarity, I suspect, up to a certain point, because I'm not convinced that the Kremlin has still completely given up on the possibility of negotiations. I think at some point they may try and say, well, look, we've now smashed the Ukrainian army, we've defeated them, we've broken them. We're going to give them another opportunity. And then, of course, there will be, again, people who will be very angry in Russia if that happens. Because make no mistake about it, there is a very, very large community of opinion in Russia, which what they want to see is the unconditional surrender of Ukraine. They're not in any mood to bargain with Ukraine, any kind of Ukraine anymore.
Yeah. The big question there is who does Russia negotiate with? Because once they smash the Ukraine military, it's hard to picture Zelensky as being the person who remains in power to even negotiate. I mean,
well, absolutely. That is absolutely correct. Yes. That is absolutely correct. There is no conceivable way that Zelensky himself, it seems to me, can be a negotiating partner in this war. Actually,
I mean,
I
he
mean, I
said
think
he wouldn't. Yeah.
exactly. He said he wouldn't, which, by the way, at the moment, I think has actually worked to Putin's advantage. It's actually suited him because you see, he can tell people like Erdogan, well, Erdogan, you're telling me all the time I should negotiate and negotiate peace. I'm happy to negotiate. It's Zelensky who is refusing to negotiate. So therefore, I have no choice but to escalate because that's what the other side is constantly doing.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. One thing is clear: the real superstar of one of the real big superstars of this entire 6-7 month affair has been the Russian Foreign Ministry,
Yeah, yeah.
the
I'm going to say,
diplomacy of Russia
absolutely.
to do what they have done. Yeah.
I mean, the way that they have managed to hold this whole thing together, to win over most of the world has been extraordinary. Because, I mean, not to beat about the bush, what the Russians have been doing, I mean, to say that it violates international law, I think that is the view that the vast majority of international lawyers would take. You can make contrary arguments. You can invoke the advisory opinion on Kosovo. But then I personally have big issues with the advisory opinion on Kosovo. I don't personally agree with it. So, I mean, what the Russians have managed to persuade most of the world, I mean, countries, that would be horrified first at supporting secessionist movements, then at, invading other countries to take control of their territory. They have consistently shown that they're willing to listen to the Russian point of view and to be persuaded round. I mean, there was one particular moment in the summer when Lavrov was on this tour of the Middle East and Africa, and he was meeting all these Arab leaders. And it was extraordinary to see how they were all listening to him and how he was explaining it to them, going it through it step by step by step, and how receptive they were to his points. And I mean, they've managed remarkably. They've been incredibly successful at this, and it's surely partly because Lavrov has done his side of the job so well that he was the person that Putin appointed to go to the Duma and put the presentations to have these territories brought into the Russian Federation. I think this was done by way of a compliment, a way of thanking him. By the way,
Yeah.
talking about people who have undoubtedly made their reputations here, at least amongst Russians, and who are, I mean, Kadyrov certainly is one, and Prigozhin, I would have thought, is another. We're going to see and hear an awful lot from those two, I think, in the coming months and years, irrespective of what happens. And I would not be surprised if we saw Prigozhin certainly, and Kadyrov quite probably, assuming a more active political role in Russia too.
Yeah. Definitely. All right. We will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.